Hello, Pre-Calc. This is going to be a trig review, and then we're going to actually talk about finding the limits of trig functions. Okay, we're going to treat everything else the same, but I wanted to make sure we go over this. Next year, when you get in calculus, I'm going to give you this sheet, but you can actually take a snap of it or whatever, and that way you have it. What this is going to do is, if I give you any angle, okay, say I want to find the cosine of 30 degrees. Well, as a degree, or as radians, is pi over 6. Remember, you'd multiply by pi over 180 or vice versa going over, but the relationship is 180 degrees equals pi radians. But for 30 degrees, there's two numbers here. The first is going to be the cosine of that angle, and the second is the sine of it. So if I said, hey, what's the cosine of 30 degrees? It would be root 3 over 2 because of this. And if I said, what's the sine of 30 degrees? It's going to be 1/2. Okay, so this is what's called the unit circle. I taught you how to do it a little bit differently. We didn't have time for all this. Just a few things you need to know. Make sure you know the secant is 1 over the cosine, and cosecant is 1 over the sine. Also know that tangent is sine over cosine, and cotangent is cosine over sine. All right, so that's going to be what the first thing that we kind of talk about initially is. Now, the second thing is we went over the graphs of all 6 of the trig functions. So if you look at the sine, this is what the graph of the sine looks like. It starts in the middle of the graph going upwards. The sine of pi over 2, which is 90 degrees, is 1. The sine of pi is 0. The sine of 270 or 3 pi over 2 is -1. So that's what the graph is. If I ask you to find the trig function of anything that falls on an axis, 0, 90, 180, 270, I want you to look to the graph, whether it be for sine or cosine or graph of tangent in this case. So if I said, okay, 0, 90, which it's undefined because that's an asymptote, 180, 270, it's undefined. So if it falls on an axis, I want you to use these graphs. So here's the graph of cotangent. If you remember, it's like tangent but backwards, but then also the asymptotes differ. So 0 is an asymptote here, and then pi is. And then here's the graph of cosecant and secant, which are just alternating parabolas. Okay, so if we want to find limits, and it's going to be a limit of any angle that falls on an axis, I want you to use these graphs. If it falls inside, then I just want you to use these things. And if you want to find secant, just find the cosine and flip it. If you want to find cosecant, find the sine and flip it. If you want to find tangent, just put sine over the cosine. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through that. But first of all, just as some quick reminders, I want you to write these in terms of sine and cosine. So immediately, I really need you to know that the cosecant of x is 1 over the sine of x. The secant of x is 1 over the cosine of x. The tangent of x is the sine of x over the cosine of x. And the cotangent is the cosine of x over the sine of x. Okay? Now the other thing, the relationship between degrees and radians, because we're going to bounce back and forth. Make sure you know that pi radians is equal to 180 degrees. So if I said, hey, 0 radians is what? You would say 0 degrees. So pi over 6 is going to be 30 degrees. Pi over 4 is 45 degrees. Pi over 3 is 60 degrees. Pi over 2 is 90 degrees. Pi is 180. 3 pi over 2 is 270. And 2 pi is 360. Okay, so just make sure you know that those correspond to one another. I taught you how to convert from one to the other, which you will take the SAT next semester. So make sure you know that anyway, but I'll review that before we get there. Okay. Cosine, sines, tangent. All right, so here's what's going to happen. If I ask you to find the sine, cosine, or tangent, if it falls on an axis, I want you to use the graphs. If not, I want you to use the unit circle. So if I said find the cosine of 0, 0 falls on an axis, so I want you to immediately to go to this thing and say, hey, what's the cosine of 0? Well, it's 1. So what's the sine of pi over 2? Well, that's 90 degrees. That falls on an axis. So you come up here and say, hey, what's the sine of pi over 2? Well, it's 1. So what's the tangent of pi? Well, it falls on an axis. So I go to the graph of tangent and say, okay, the tangent of pi is 0. So if I said, hey, what's the cotangent of pi over 4? Well, that's not on an axis. So that means I want to look at this. So cotangent is going to be cosine over sine. So what you do is you take the cosine, which is root 2 over 2, and put it over the sine, which is root 2 over 2. So root 2 over 2 over root 2 over 2 is just 1. So to find the secant of pi over 6, well, it doesn't fall on an axis. So if it falls inside a quadrant, I want you to use the unit circle. So you go over here and you go to pi over 6. Now the cosine of pi over 6 is this value. However, the secant's the reciprocal of that. So it's going to be 2 over root 3. So you flip it and do the reciprocal, which is 2 over root 3. So when you rationalize it, it's 2 root 3 over 3. And finally, how do you find the cosecant of pi? Well, you go to the graph of cosecant because pi falls on an axis. So if it falls on an axis, now if you look, it's an asymptote. And what do we say about asymptotes? We say it does not exist. Okay, so that's just some basic stuff. Okay, so here's what's going to happen is I'm going to ask you to find the limits of trig functions. So let's just start here. Now, the tricky part about some of these is I would say, hey, pi over 2 is from the left. Well, if it's pi over 2, if it falls on an axis, I want you to use the graph. So I go to the graph and I look at pi over 2. Well, it's an asymptote. Okay, now normally I would put the limit does not exist, but my problem is a one-sided limit. So if it's ever a one-sided limit, you say, hey, I'm approaching it from the left. Which direction is my graph going? It's going upwards, so you'd say infinity. Okay, as I'm going to approach cosecant from 0 from the right. So I go to 0 in cosecant, which is right here. It's on an axis. I'm looking at it from the right. It's going upwards, so I would put infinity. Cotangent as I approach negative pi over 2 from the left. So I go to cotangent. I go to negative pi over 2. Well, no matter if it's coming from the left or right, it's not an asymptote, so you just put 0. So let's look at this one. The sine of negative pi over 2. Well, I'm going to come up here. Negative pi over 2 is down here at negative 1. The secant of pi from the positive side. So how do I find the secant of pi from the positive side? I go to the graph of secant. I find pi, and if you look, it's not an asymptote. So where is it at pi? It's at negative 1. And this one, find the cosine of pi. Well, you can just look here and say, hey, what's the cosine of pi? Well, it's down here at negative 1. Okay. Guys, I actually had some other problems I wanted to do with you guys, but that's all I have with me right now. So try to do the other ones. But like I said, I want you to use this unit circle and see what you can come up with. Okay. I'm going to give you problems with all the homework on there, and hopefully when I go over it, if you didn't get it, it'll help you out. Okay, remember, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to call me, email me, text me, whatever. All right, thanks and have a good day.